And
Yep.
we will go ahead and get started because I think we have a good group here. And we welcome you to day 4 of our Coaching and Leadership Fellowship, which is totally virtual this year. Again, I'm Paul Glatter. I'm Executive Director of the Media Project and editor of Religion Unplugged. So it's my turn again today to be the host or MC. Melissa's traveling. She'll be back online tomorrow from New York. And I'm delighted that we have a new speaker in our lineup this year, and that is Lynn Walsh. And Lynn, just a few quick points about her, and she can tell us a little more about her background during her presentation. But she is involved. She's a journalism educator. She's involved with Trusting News, which she'll tell us more about, a group that's working on really important questions and themes in journalism today. And a lot of, she was formerly the president of Society of Professional Journalists, our leading sort of association of journalists in America. And she's had significant experience as a broadcast journalist in TV news, and she can tell you more about that. I see quite a few broadcasters here today, and hopefully you feel represented in our speakers with Lynn here today. So Lynn, thanks for being here. We look forward to learning with you in the next couple of hours.
Great, thank you so much. I am very glad to be here. Before I share my screen, I am going to put a link here in the chat to the presentation. Sometimes it might be easier for you to follow along if you want to kind of see it side by side somewhere or pull it up. So I'm just going to put a link there, but I will be sharing my screen full as well. So there's a link to what I'll be going through today. So now I'm going to share my screen here, and we should be good to go. So as Paul said, a couple other things, I guess, sort of housekeeping things. I will be kind of pausing throughout to ask questions and have kind of a little bit of discussion throughout this 2-hour training. So feel free to, when we get to that point, use the chat. And or if you want, we can have you unmute yourself if you'd like to as well, and kind of comment there using video and audio. Paul also will be monitoring the chat throughout. So feel free, if you have questions, to put them in there. I have given Paul permission to interrupt me if there is a good question that I may be not seeing, and we will take it kind of as we go. So as Paul said, I work with an organization called Trusting News. I have been working with them now for about 4 years, and the whole point of Trusting News is to help rebuild trust between the public and journalists. And we'll talk about why that's important as I give some data about where trust stands when we first kick off the presentation. But when we try to work to rebuild trust, really our point is to try to work with journalists to rebuild the trust. And we try to get them to do that by being more transparent about the reporting process, and also by encouraging them to engage with their audience. And I'm going to give some examples of that today. And so a little bit about me. I've spent about 15 years working as a journalist. Primarily, I've worked in broadcast, so at local television stations across the United States. I've worked for a couple online only platforms as well. And primarily my background is as an investigative journalist. I've been a reporter, a producer, and a news manager. As Paul mentioned, I am a former national president of the Society of Professional Journalists, and I am a former ethics chair for them. Many of you are probably familiar with SPJ's Code of Ethics. And so that is something that I worked with them to answer questions about all over the primarily US, but also worldwide. So currently the assistant director at Trusting News, and then also I'm an adjunct professor at a local university in San Diego, which is where I'm based, except today I'm coming to you from a hotel room in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, as I'm leading another presentation at a conference later today. So the first question I have for you, and we're going to talk about this, but what do people think of the news? What are some comments or some feedback you have received about the news? When you tell them you're a journalist, when you tell them you're a reporter, you're an editor, what do they say? And feel free to use the chat. I also am going to stop sharing here for a second so that I can kind of see if people want to unmute themselves to answer that question. But when you tell people you're a journalist, what's the reaction you get?
I think if you can share the Indian context, there are certain brands which are perennially associated with certain political parties. So if someone says I'm from this media, so automatically they link you with that particular political party's ideology. And it changes if that particular party is in power, then they would be seen to be giving everything to be honky-dory. If they're in the opposition, they may be seen to be giving the perception that they may blow things out of proportion. But if you look for the national channels, yes, some are known to be right-wing, some are known to be extremely objective, credible. So every name is having some kind of a clear association for readers or viewers.
Okay, so when you tell them you're a journalist and who you work for, they're able to sort of, or they group you with what your political views might be.
That's
okay.
right.
Yeah. Anyone else want to share about anything that someone, as you've maybe told family or friends that you're a journalist, what the reaction has been? Jacob, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. Are you getting me, Lynn?
Yes, we can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, my experience shows from the end of the Liberian society. The first thing when you tell somebody that you are a journalist, there are a few who recognize you as someone who belongs to a profession by your calling to serve society and humanity. There are lots of people, depending on the kind of media institution you associate with, they try to classify you. For example, I spent over 15 years at the Liberia Broadcasting System, which is the state-owned, media entity. And there are people who think that the fact that you work for the Liberia Broadcasting System, you are strictly owned and controlled by the Liberian government. So the perception is that you cannot give a fair description of issues that are happening in the society. Now, there are others who also see you as someone who is a troublemaker, the fact that your work uncovers lots of negative things in society. So these are the kind of descriptions that people attach to you in the Liberian context and based on the kind of media institution that you are employed with. That's my experience.
Thank you so much. So you have some people that will assume that you are will assume that you are someone who might be biased or associated with a certain viewpoint. And then also there are other people though that think you are a troublemaker. I kind of like that description as someone who was an investigative journalist. That's something I definitely have been told, but may see that as a good thing, that you are trying to hold people accountable and uncover things. Obviously, if you're uncovering something about them, they may not like it very much, but you are there for the accountability. Thank you so much, Jacob. And feel free again to put some of these comments in the chat as well. So what, let's see, someone is saying, we as a public service broadcaster, a big raise of audience during COVID. People choose the news, especially at the time of election. We're actually going to talk about that, how COVID has impacted people's views of news and of how much they trust in news. So thank you for mentioning that there in the chat.
I see another direct message that came to me from someone here. Patricia says, most of the people say that news have been directed by powerful people in the country to favor them, or rather journalists have been bought by the government to say what it wants the mass to know and hide other issues of the public. So I guess in Africa, some African contexts and other countries where government does play roles in some media, that affects the trust of people and maybe people's general perceptions of different media outlets.
Right, and we have some of that in the United States as well, and not even just being the association with the government, but more that journalists are the elite. They're the people who are part of the power, and so sometimes they are not trusted by certain groups of individuals. And then someone else, Rachel, direct message said, can relate with Jacob and Sam. Those in authority fear the newsmakers, that accountability, and that definitely is true as well. And sometimes that means you're doing a good job because you're uncovering things that they don't want anyone else to know about. So I really appreciate you sharing. Please feel free to continue to use the chat. And Paul, again, will interrupt me as I go along. I'm going to share my screen again, and we're going to talk a little bit about what the data shows about what people think about the news. And as I am kind of getting this set up here, I'll tell a story there for a while, I guess, before pre-COVID. I was traveling a lot for my work with Trusting News and doing some other training work. And every time I would get in an Uber or Lyft getting picked up from the airport, they'd ask me what I would do. And I would say I'm a journalist. And sometimes it became a conversation that was really hard to have because people constantly were saying, oh, but fake news, or, oh, can't trust the news, all of that. And it became a tiring conversation, but an important one to have because you wanted to kind of explain to them, no, there's real news and there's real information out there. And there are people like all of you that work really hard to hold people accountable and spread the good news. And so it's something I continue to do, but it did become a little tiring at times. And we'll give you some tips on how to respond to people who may say that today. So we're going to look quickly here at the state of trust over time. So if you were to guess if people trust in news, feel free to put the answer there in the chat of what you think, if trust in news is high or low. Unfortunately, it is pretty low. There is some good news from a recent survey from the Reuters Digital News Report of 2021. They did find that overall, all around the world, trust in news has gone up a little bit compared to last year in almost all countries. So we're seeing a little bit of a slight rebound in trust. What's really interesting is when you ask people if they trust in news, they might say no. But if you ask them if they trust in the news that they consume, most people will say yes. And so what this survey found and what other surveys have found is people are more likely to trust the news that they use than they are to trust news very globally. When you look at countries that have the highest trust versus the lowest trust, Finland remains the country with the highest level of trust at 65% of people saying they trust news in that country. The United States has the lowest at 29%. And again, that's according to that Reuters Digital News Report. Something else that's interesting that they found is that this trust gap between news in general, so television, newspaper, radio, that trust gap between whether people trust TV, newspaper, radio, and news that they find online, maybe it's social media or online only news organizations, there is a larger trust gap, and that gap continues to be larger. And so if you look at this chart, basically trust overall has grown, trust in digital or social media has continued to decline. So this gap between whether you trust social media or you trust news overall continues to spread. But at the same time this is happening, more people are consuming news online, but also saying that they don't necessarily trust it. So this is just a quick graph that shows where trust in the US is. So again, according to that Reuters report, trust in the US is the lowest out of all the countries that were surveyed. And that report had it at 29%. The latest data that Gallup has it at 40%, so still pretty low, but it's better than it was during 2016. In 2016, we hit our lowest point here in the US. And when people ask, why is trust low? Why is this happening? Here in the US, when they look at the data, they talk a lot about how a lot of this decline happened prior to the internet. A lot of times journalists want to say, oh, it's because of the internet, it's because of social media. But really, trust has been slowly declining before that. And there are a couple reasons and things that people point to specifically here in the US, but this applies worldwide in some cases as well. Just there are more choices. The fact that cable news came on board and there were 24-hour news stations, not just here in the US, but all over the world, that made the media landscape more complicated. And so what that meant is people had more choices. That also meant that there were stations and people that were putting out content that maybe was more biased toward one political side or another. You also had, obviously, the internet, you had social media. Here in the US, we had some deregulation that allowed for more partisan talk radio, more cable. But I think it's important to think of that when we think of trust and how low it is right now, we can't just blame social media. We cannot just blame the internet. This has been something that kind of has slowly been eroding for years. And so we need to look at, as journalists, how can we fix this and make it better, and not just kind of throw up our hands and say, oh, it's not our fault. It's Facebook's fault or it's Twitter's fault, because we can do some things to make it better as well. And so a couple other some more data here related to this, again, comes from the Reuters Digital News Report. Another good sign for trust is it did find that countries with strong and independent public service media do see a greater consumption of trusted news brands. And that is true in Western Europe. Outside of Western Europe, that pattern is less clear and consistent. And what they found is that countries where the coronavirus and the pandemic has dominated the media agenda less, they did not see as much increase in trust. They also found that countries that had political or social issues where they played a big role, so things like social justice movements or big elections, countries that had those going on in the last year and a half saw more declines in trust compared to others. Another kind of, I think, good thing for journalists that this found worldwide is that despite there being more options to read and watch partisan news, a majority of people around the world say that they prefer news that reflects a range of views and lets them decide what to think. So even though we have more and more options that are partisan, might be associated with an opinion or a political party, most people around the world are saying, we would rather have news that has a range of views and lets us decide what to think. And most also say they want news outlets to try to be neutral on every issue. And it's interesting when you look at that question of being neutral or allowing more perspective into a story. Younger people worldwide believe that impartiality may not be appropriate when it comes to certain issues. Social justice is one of those, that it might not be appropriate for a news organization to be impartial about human rights or social justice for people. Something else that this looked at, the report, and this again applies all around the world when they were looking at different countries and how people responded, they found that the value of sort of traditional local and regional news is increasingly being based on a small number of subjects. So when they asked people, what are you getting from your local news or from your regional news that you value? And before, there used to be a really long list, but for whatever reason, that list of what people value that they're getting from local and regional news has shrunk. And so now, two of the main things that people say they get from local and regional news that say that they value are local politics and crime. They used to say weather, housing, jobs, things to do in my city. But now people are turning to internet sites and social media to get that information instead of their traditional local or regional news organizations. So when we talked about distrust and how overall trust in news is higher than it was compared to last year. We're back at levels basically about from 2018. The countries where there is a trust deficit, which means there are more people who distrust the news than trust it, include the United States, Bulgaria, France, Hungary, Chile, and Argentina. Now, there are places where there are more people who trust news than distrust it. 3 of those places are Denmark, Finland, and the Netherlands. Just a quick kind of look here at what is going on in the European Union, they have seen a steady decline over the past 5 years in the confidence in media. Specifically in Germany, trust in newspapers and magazines has decreased by 12% between 2014 and 2019. But they still have a majority of Germans that do trust newspapers at 65%. In Spain, they have a much larger group that distrust newspapers. And it's even higher for online news platforms. The other thing that this is another survey, a Global Advisor survey from 2019. There is a stark division between highly trusted media in countries like Germany and Sweden and low trust media in Southern Europe, most notably in Spain. Just quick kind of highlights for France and Italy. France distrust has dramatically increased there in France. And some of the reasons they believe that is happening is because of Yellow Vest protest coverage and this perception of a growing divide between ordinary citizens and the elite there in Paris. And I forget who mentioned kind of this elite, I think it might've been Jacob, but this thought that journalists aren't there for everyday people, that they are there and they are part of the elite is something that you kind of can see in other countries, not just France, we see it here in the US. And so that can lead to distrust. In Italy, they have about half and half. About half people say that they generally trust journalists and half say they actively distrust journalists. In Eastern Europe, it's a lot different of a situation. The trust index is just plummeting. So there is a lot of distrust in Eastern Europe. And some of the reasons they give for that is the resurgence of nationalism, a spread of authoritarian and illiberal tendencies. This is happening especially in Serbia and Hungary. Now, when we think about how, if you're willing to trust news or if you trust news and how that relates to your age or your political leanings, it does vary greatly. And so this survey, the Reuters Digital News Report, again, a worldwide survey, they found in Western Europe that the younger age group, 18 to 24, feel the least fairly represented by the media. And what that means is when they feel that they're not being represented by the media, they're less likely to trust it, they're less likely to pay for content or support the news organization, and they're just less likely to read the news organization or watch the content. And one of the reasons they gave is they just said there are too little coverage of the issues that they care about. And this report kind of asked the question, if younger people feel less represented in mainstream news organizations, TV, radio, newspapers, does this explain the embrace of finding content on social media? Because 40% of people surveyed said social media is their main source of news. And I think that probably would be a good explanation. If you're not seeing your stories and things you care about reflected in mainstream news, you might go somewhere else to find it. And we talked about there that if they're less interested in the media, then they're less likely to pay for news, which is very important, kind of impacts our ability to survive and pay attention to it. Here in the US, we see the same thing reflected. People who are younger are less likely to have trust in news compared to people who are older, age 50 and over. Something that here in the US has become a very stark data point in trust in news is the number of people who identify as Democrat or Republicans, and then if they say that they trust in news. And this most recent data shows that people who are Republican or identify as Republican, only 10% of them say that they have a fair amount or a great deal of trust in news. That's compared to about 73% of people who identify as Democrats. And so when you think about that, that's 1 in 10 people who identify as conservatives. And if you look at the last election, maybe about 50-50. That's a big problem here in the US that we're having to deal with, that partisan divide and that everything has become so politicized and polarized. Something else that's interesting about the partisan view is that when you ask Republicans specifically and Democrats specifically, what are your main sources of news? Like, who do you go to? Republicans primarily trust one source, and that's Fox News. Democrats, on the other hand, kind of spread their trust out along about 5 different outlets. They say CNN, some will say NBC, some say ABC, some say CBS, some say PBS, but Democrats are more likely to not just give one answer. They spread it out around 5, versus Republicans primarily say Fox News is their most trusted source. They do trust some others, ABC, CBS, Hannity Radio, NBC, but primarily it is Fox News. So in the UK, when we talk about politics and how that relates to trust, both the left and the right feel that their political views are unfairly covered. Again, the youngest group feels least fairly represented by the media. And there are some gender differences as far as if men or women are more likely to trust news. And those gender differences get greater as the group that you're talking to is younger. In Germany, they have a similar problem with young people trusting news. Also, those on the right do not trust in news, and they use terms like the lying press to express that unhappiness. So something that I did want to talk about, and then I want to just a couple more slides, and I was going to open it up for some comments or questions. How does misinformation or the spread of disinformation impact the level of trust that someone has? And what the Reuters digital news report found is that globally, there are major concerns about false or misleading information, and that has increased this year compared to last year. And some of the numbers here, the greatest number, 82% of people in Brazil say that they have concerns about false or misleading information. 37% of people in Germany say they have that concern. And when you look at specifically misinformation and trust, those who use social media are more likely to say they have been exposed to misinformation, specifically about COVID-19 and the pandemic. People do name Facebook as one of the main channels for spreading that false information, but messaging apps like WhatsApp are also seen as a big problem for the spread of misinformation. And specifically in the global South, Brazil, Indonesia, it's seen as a very big problem to people living in those areas. And so I want to take a break here. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I wanted to see, does this data reflect what you are seeing where you live? And so I'd love to see what people say. Does this data reflect what you are seeing?
Yes, Lynn, you want us to make a comment?
Yes, please. Yeah, thank you.
All right. My name is Josephine Karani. I'm from Kenya, and I'm a broadcast journalist of many years. Concerning misinformation, your last slide, yes, indeed, social media, even here at home, is likely to spread more misinformation and fake news because there are no gatekeepers, really. I mean, I can just come out of here and just concoct something and just throw it out there in the social platform. So yes, social media platforms, I think, are the greatest spreaders of fake news, misinformation, disinformation, because there are no gatekeepers. You are your own gatekeeper. You just put out something you want to put out, and voila, that is it. Mainstream media, at least there are checks and balances to some extent, but that doesn't mean that misinformation also doesn't seep to the audiences. So, but at least there is moderation in how news goes out from those houses. Thank you.
Yes, no, thank you so much. And I think, you said something that I think is really important, that, people just kind of can throw anything out there and there isn't maybe anyone fact checking it. And or as a consumer, it's confusing because you see something out there, you read it, you watch it, and you really don't have any reason to believe that it's not true. We kind of see our cousin share it or an uncle, and we think, okay, of course it is. Like, why would we not think that that's true? And then it just keeps spreading. And so part of, I think, something that is our role as journalists is to help the public be more critical news consumers and be able to tell the difference between something that has been fact checked, the work that you do, versus someone that is just writing something and sharing it on social. Sam, did you want to share?
Yes, I think in my view, a large percentage of population really don't care about credible news at all because they don't pay for it, and they're fine with getting a sense of the broader trends, unless something that affects them very much. For example, during the pandemic time, people did rely on mainstream media for credible news because there were lots of things which directly impacted them, and they didn't want to really go by that. But for these exceptions, largely otherwise, they're quite happy with getting a sense of what's happening, but not really bothered about how much of that is fact, how much of that is a kind of an agenda-driven disinformation or misinformation, because they don't pay for it, while they hold other media houses to account. For example, they pay money for entertainment, they pay money for Netflix. Unlike news, they're not willing to pay. They take it for granted that news ought to come to them free, and so they're fine with what they get on WhatsApp and happily forwarding it, knowing fully well it may not be credible. I think a churn is happening thanks to the pandemic, but the larger belief is that they don't really bother about it.
Yeah, and some of that, thank you for sharing that, because I think that data reflected that during the pandemic, we actually saw trust in news increase because people needed information. They needed it to go about their daily life. It was a life or death situation for so many people, and they were relying on that accurate reporting and realized, I do need this. I want to consume this in order to go about my daily life. I think your point about Netflix is so interesting. And I think it also is reflected in the data that, if younger people feel as if we as journalists aren't covering topics that are interesting to them or that they care about, will they ever turn to us? And I think that's a question, we as journalists need to think about, like, what topics are we covering? Should we shift coverage goals a little bit? And maybe not, maybe we don't need to, but I think it's a question we should be asking ourselves. There's a term in broadcast, like, that's a newspaper story, we're not going to tell it. I don't know if anyone has heard that before.
Yes, very much, yes.
But that is something that I've heard said in every news television station I've worked in. And it's one that's frustrating me, because I think if it's a story people need to know about it, we need to find a way to tell it. We need to find a way to make it interesting. We need to find a way, to make it compelling. And that doesn't mean that we give up covering government because it may be boring. No, we have to continue doing that, but let's find a way to make it impact them, show how it impacts their life, and relate to them so they are consuming that content.
Secondly, if you can add just quickly, sorry.
Go ahead.
Second, news is also being consumed as entertainment. The audience we are catering to are increasingly becoming non-serious, and the umpteen number of content they get as news on YouTube, which may not really fulfill the strict guidelines and privacy issues or ethics we are governed by. We can't simply cater to that kind of a demand at all, and that's again a larger reason why they find mainstream media's news dull, very limited, uninteresting, whereas they get so much of unlimited content flooded free and in a very exciting way from their point of view.
Yeah, I think that yes, go ahead, Rachel.
Just to add on to maybe what Sam and Josephine have said, is I really agree, like what you reflected in your slides really reflects also even like in Kenya or in Africa, especially the tendency of a lot of people using the social media platforms as opposed to mainstream. And it's not just a preserve of the youth. Of course, more youth on social media platforms, but it's become the tendency that that is the place where all news is breaking. Unfortunately, then propagandists are then also using the platforms to misinform or disinform. And this is deliberate, and especially now that we're getting into an election mode because we are having our elections next year, it's increasing all the time. Actually, very few people who care about news, maybe those who really believe in news, will go to mainstream to confirm. But otherwise, now when somebody hears something is happening, the first stop is Twitter, social media platforms, and kind of then the story just goes on and on and on. And then people choose what to believe and what not to believe based on their political affiliation. So, and when you look at the statistics, the reports, the surveys that are done, people are gravitating towards social media, maybe because it's also easy, because like people will say, why should I even wait for the news? I already know what's in the news. So it's only those who care to confirm, like, was this really right? And it's becoming a big challenge to journalists. Like we keep saying, then our role is actually to be more detailed, to do a lot of research, to give more information, but also journalists are being led or are being guided by what is happening on social media. So there's a lot of reports actually even on mainstream that you'll see tied to Twitter, what's happening on social media, or journalists will follow what is breaking on social media to then follow that as a lead, to follow that story to, to give it some depth.
Yes. Yes, thank you so much. And Paul, did you want to say something? I think possibly.
Oh, well, I just wanted to say I've got some direct messages. I can read comments from people who may be at work and can't speak.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, this is really a lot of fascinating and interesting ideas popping around here. I look forward to continuing this. So first up is Doreen, who, this is a comment, and Doreen writes, social media is at the forefront of spreading fake news, and people don't care whether it's factual. That kind of aligns with other comments we've heard, I think. All right, let me know, Lynn, if you want to comment on any of these comments. Here's another one that came in from Wanjiru, who writes, on my point of view, I believe that misinformation and distrust has grown since people believe social media or internet is quick and easily accessible to achieve news rather than wait for us journalists to reveal any info. Again, kind of lining up some thoughts that we've heard. And then Martina from Czech Republic, a radio journalist, gives some interesting context from her country and writes, there could be similar distribution of distrust here in the Czech Republic as between the Republican Democrat voters in the US. One of the popular myths among populist party voters is that George Soros is influencing a lot of liberal media, and that NGOs are functioning as opinion makers. Today, I saw Janez Janša, the Prime Minister of Slovenia, now holding the EU presidency, tweeted a chart about an alleged link between Soros and a number of EU politicians, such as Martin Schulz in Germany and others. Some pensioners share such myths in chain emails. That one's quite interesting, I think, in its relation to our context, Lynn.
Yeah, so I was going to, I'm going to put something here in the chat. I'm not sure if any of you follow an organization called, excuse me, it's called First Draft News. They work here in the US. They also work around the world. And they have really great tips for reporting on misinformation and disinformation. So I put that link in there. But something they talk about is something called the tipping point. And so the idea here is that if something is spreading or people in your community are talking about something that you know is not true, it's based on false information, it is not based in fact. The question that comes up in newsrooms is, how do we cover this? And should we pay attention to it, right? Or do we just ignore it? And what the tipping point talks about is that in some cases, if it's a very small group of people talking about it and they're all similar or like-minded, or they're part of the same group and that's how they heard about it, probably doesn't rise to the level of covering it. But when it could rise to the level of covering it is if the people that are talking to it are all parts of different groups, right? They might be part of a church here. They're part of a youth group here. It's reaching all sorts of different people. Or if it's being widely shared by someone who is in a position of power or who is famous, a celebrity, someone like that, a sports star, that is when it's actually better for us as news organizations to cover the false information and correct the false information so that it doesn't continue to spread and people believe it. And I think for early on, news organizations thought, oh no, I'm not going to touch this. Like it's not true. We don't want to cover it. We don't want to continue to spread it. But actually what data and research has shown is it's better if we decide to cover it and tell people that it's false while also correcting and giving them the correct information. So that link I think is super helpful. They have lots of tools on their website about how to cover false information, misinformation, disinformation, but that article in particular, I think will be really helpful. Something with how misinformation and disinformation relates to trust is we found at Trusting News that people value news organizations that correct misinformation. So fact-checking organizations, doing a fact check once in a while on something if it rises to that level. On social media, on your Facebook profiles, maybe in a WhatsApp channel that you have, if you see misinformation spreading, have a reporter jump in and kind of correct it with a link to your story that has the correct information. People value that. And then what it does is it allows them to, it increases their trust in your individual journalist or in your news organization. So I know sometimes it might be easier to be like, not going to touch it. I don't know what to say, but if it reaches that tipping point, we should try our best to correct that misinformation and be sort of take the role of the responsible parent, if you will, that you are there to give them the support and good information that they need. And so I'm going to share. Oh yeah, go ahead, Paul.
There's a couple more comments, and I just to think with you a little bit on what Martina said and what you just said, Lynn. Some of our members, Martina brought up George Soros, and he does have an interest in media. For those who don't know who Soros is, he is originally from, I believe, Hungary, hedge fund kind of finance trader who's made a lot of money. I believe he's a billionaire, and he's a philanthropist, and he gives to many causes. And what's interesting that I've noticed is, I mean, I when I've seen what he donates to, I see some things that I think are really good and some things that I question. And he does have more liberal views on certain topics. But one thing that I've seen is the conservatives in the US and Eastern Europe do attack him. And there's some conspiracy theories around him. And what I've seen that the media sometimes then will fact check and say, these conspiracies are not true, but sometimes they're not acknowledging things that he has said or donated to that are clearly causes that bother conservatives. So it's almost like there's not a full account or context about who that person is. And then therefore the trust of the conservatives in the Czech Republic or the United States remains low, not only in Soros, but in the media. That's just kind of a comment on that. And then I can read the other comments from our attendees here when you want.
Okay, yeah, I think I wanted to share a couple, because now I feel like I set it up and I don't want everyone to be down, because guess what? There are solutions. There are things that we can do to combat this problem and to rebuild trust. And so I wanted to get into that a little bit here next. And that's what the next hour and plus that we're together, that's what we are going to focus on. And so let me share my screen again. I want to just give two quick examples of what I have seen some news organizations do. So this is a news organization here they're in Jefferson City in the United States. And so when we talk about, I've seen some other comments pop there in the chat that talk about just the spread of false information on social media. One thing you can do is take a stand against it. And this is something that a newsroom that we've worked with at Trusting News did. They basically just posted on Facebook saying, we hate fake news too. What's really good though is what they wrote over here. And they say, you know, fake news culture is real. We don't want to be a part of it. We're invested in maintaining our community's trust. So we've outlined our mission, values, and history in Jefferson City to demonstrate that. And then they link to a page where they talk about their values as a news organization, things that they care about, their ethics, how they fact check. And they had really good questions. You know, they had people say, worthy goals I hope are achieved. Someone asked, what do you consider fake news? And they gave a definition. So this is the kind of engagement and being outspoken about it that can help. Something else that another news organization did at the Coloradoan, and I was trying to quickly find the example, but I was unable to pull it up really quickly. But basically, they have stated on their Facebook page that they will delete comments that are false. So basically, that if there are false comments being posted on their Facebook page, they are going to delete those. And they say, why are we deleting them? Because we are here to provide responsible information, real information. Yes, you can have conversations. Yes, you can share opinions, but we will not tolerate the spread of misinformation or unverified information. And for them, what that has done is that it has created a less toxic situation on their Facebook page. They're able to actually have conversations with their community. Community members are able to actually talk to one another instead of this yelling or kind of trolling that happens. And so it's something to consider as a news organization that, yes, we're here for people to share their opinions, but we're not here to allow for the spread of misinformation. And are you willing to kind of take that stand and then enforce it where it might happen in your comments or on your social media? And so coming back to solutions, those are kind of two solutions related to that. And we have a lot more on our website that I can share with you if you want to reach out individually. But the question now is, we know there's misinformation spreading. We know disinformation is spreading. We know trust is lower than we would want it to be in news. So what should all of you who are responsible, ethical, mission-driven journalists do? And the first thing is we have to realize and recognize that we are part of the media. When people say media, we are a part of that. But that doesn't have to define how your audience sees you. So just because when you ask someone, do you trust news? Do you trust media? We're all lumped in this kind of group together. That doesn't mean, though, that when we talk about our publication or our TV station, our radio station, that we can't be different and work to define how we are trustworthy. And so that's kind of the whole goal. The goal here is that we're all lumped into this, but how can we make sure people know that we are different? And part of this is understanding that not all journalism is good journalism. So something I like to say is that in the day now of social media, YouTube, the internet, anyone can commit an act of journalism. So anyone can spread information, right? Anyone can share their opinion, can share information, can record something happening out their window. That doesn't necessarily make them a journalist, though. It also doesn't necessarily make it responsible, ethical reporting. It could be information, it could be a fact. It could also be totally not true because someone wants to spread disinformation. And so we have to understand that that is what the public is constantly seeing. They're seeing good journalism, they're seeing bad journalism. And we need to be willing to, when people are critical of our journalism or maybe make an assumption about our work that's incorrect, we need to keep this in mind because we should be conscientious and kind of empathetic to the fact that it's hard to navigate the information space right now. And we should also be willing to say, hey, that link that you sent me, that actually is not something I would recommend reading because of these reasons. And we have to be willing to not try to defend the whole industry. And so that's why when you're trying to differentiate yourself and trying to build trust, the goal here is to talk about your work, what makes your work trustworthy. You're not trying to defend all media because we can't do that. Instead, you're going to talk about your mission, your ethics, and the process behind your reporting and what sets you apart. And then something else that I think is really, really important to mention as we talk about kind of rebuilding trust, you're not going to win everyone over. There are some people who just will never trust you. There are some people who will always believe in some conspiracy theories, and you're not going to win them over or bring them to the truth. And so we like to think of people as being kind of on a spectrum of trust. There are some people who will never trust you. There are some people who are always going to trust you, but most people are here in the middle. Even though it may not seem like that, when you maybe look at your Facebook comments or the emails you get, remember, those are probably the extremes. Those are the people reaching out to you on this end. We want to talk to the people here in the middle and focus on those people that we can give more information to and talk openly about how we do our jobs. When you work to rebuild trust and you talk about your work, you talk about your values, you talk about how you're ethical, it is important to kind of look at trust in more of a like broader sense. So if you were to think about the people that you trust, most likely they're people that you know and have had a relationship with for a long time. They might be family members, friends, colleagues, but they're people you've grown to know, right? And there's a reason you trust them. They've continued to show up. They continue to be reliable. You have fun with them, whatever that might be, but it's based in a relationship. And so when we're thinking about rebuilding trust, we have to keep that in mind. We have to build a relationship with our community. And that's going to happen over a couple different ways. People, when they think about trust and who they trust, there's an affective dimension and a cognitive dimension. So what this means is that people trust with their head and they trust with their heart. There are just some people who people just trust because every time they see them, they make them smile, they make them laugh, they make them happy. There's a trust in a relationship that is built. There are other people that they trust people because they've continued to show up. They're reliable. They have a reputation. They're competent. They're credible. And so when we are thinking about that, we have to remember that building trust is going to involve showing a little bit about ourselves, being willing to talk a little bit about ourselves and who we are, being willing to build a relationship on more that heart level, that emotional level, but also being willing to be consistent, be reliable, be credible. And I think journalists are really good at the head part, the data, right? We're good at being consistent. We really try not to make a mistake. Sometimes where we struggle is with the heart part and how can we build that relationship in a way that we're kind of building more than just, here's the news, it's always there for you, but that it is something that they want to watch. And something else that I do hear from journalists is they say, well, why do we have to do this? I'm just going to keep doing the same thing I've been doing, which is reporting the news, being consistent with it, not having corrections. Unfortunately, that's not enough in this day and age. Those are good intentions, but that kind of, if you take that kind of attitude, it's not going to lead to automatic trust anymore. It used to, but it doesn't anymore. We need to do more than just report the facts and walk away. And I'll tell you a little bit about some things that you can do. So if you want to rebuild trust, you want to rebuild trust in those relationships with your community. First, you're going to accept that earning trust is the job of everyone in the newsroom, not just the digital team, not just the person, not just the youngest person in the newsroom. It's the job of everyone. And then you're going to understand mistrust, which we did a little bit today. Then we're going to work to address misassumptions and also tell a better story about your journalism. And this is something that is needed on two levels. So at Trusting News, when we talk about rebuilding trust, there are things that a news organization can do. What are your ethics? What's your mission? If you have that written down somewhere, now make it public, link to it, talk about it. If you don't have it written down, let's write it down, let's create it, let's then share it. But you also need to add this kind of transparency and these explanations of how journalism works to your everyday stories. So everyday stories need to talk about, like, why did you choose this story? Why did you talk to these people? How did you work to be fair in this story? So those are the things that come day to day. And something that I want to just go back to here, just to kind of make sure we're kind of all on the same page. So this address misassumptions is so important, because most of the time when I've asked someone what they think about news and they say something negative or something like, oh, it's biased, they have an agenda, you're unfair, you don't tell the truth. When I ask them more about that, most of those beliefs are based in the fact that they don't understand how journalism works. And so what happens is, when they don't understand how journalism works, they fill that void with an assumption. Normally, that's a negative assumption, and it's something that's not true. So, for example, if someone says, oh, they just always have an agenda, and you ask them, well, why do you think that? And they tell you an example of a story. Let's take a sports story, for example. And they say, well, you always cover this high school team. You never cover the high school my kids go to. And that's just because, you know, someone must have kids that go there. So that's where their mind goes, because they don't understand the process of why they're covering this high school. And it turns out you're probably covering the high school because they might be the top rated. Maybe it's the closest to your newsroom and it's the easiest to get to. I mean, whatever the reason is, it's most likely not because you have the sports reporters' kids that go to that school. And so if we can fill that gap with explanations of how we do our jobs, what our values are, people will be more likely to trust us. And I've seen this in so many conversations I've had personally, but also with newsrooms that we've worked with, and I'll share some of those examples. And so as you are thinking about how this is needed, what you're going to do to address these misassumptions, remember, again, not everyone is worth engaging with. Some people don't believe in facts, and we're going to kind of forget about those people from now on, for right now. We're going to focus on people that are willing to have a conversation and understand what we do. So I have another question for all of you based on kind of what we just talked about. What do you think, or what do you wish your community knew about how you do your journalism? So what do you wish someone knew about your daily job and how you do the work every day? And feel free to use the chat or unmute yourself.
I think one is the process of getting credible information. They don't have any idea. For instance, we come from a situation where, as a policy, increasingly elected leaders, be it the prime minister, be it chief ministers, they choose to not speak to the media. And it comes down, the senior officers, police officers, increasingly they keep quiet. And they increasingly rely on social media. They make it appear as if these leaders are very community friendly, very interactive, because it's one-sided. They build a perception like that, but the reality is that they hide behind this, and they don't really open themselves to any kind of democratic scrutiny, including scrutiny by the media. And if readers and viewers can understand how difficult it is to even speak to an officer, to speak to the right people, to give them the right information, then so much of criticism would be less, and they would have a clear, empathetic view of the challenges we as journalists face.
Yes. Oh my gosh, I'm so glad you brought that up, because that is something that I think I saw a lot of some head shaking. I feel like maybe all of us can relate to that, where you've tried to talk to someone and you just can't. You want to talk to them. You want to include their opinion or their side. You want to directly ask them a question, but for whatever reason, you don't have access to do that. Maybe someone's not allowing you to, maybe they are refusing to speak with you. But so what people assume, and I've talked to many people who have made this assumption, is that we have access to all the information we want. We're like supposed to be all knowing. And that's what the assumption is. The assumption is, you know, when you tell someone, well, I can't talk about that because I don't have any information on it. They're like, well, what do you mean? You have access to everything. And so we don't, though. We are limited by the information we can get. And so if we're willing to talk about that more, people then understand, like, oh, wow, you can't tell that story because you don't have, I can't get that document. Like, I don't know what that is because I can't see it and I can only report on what I see. And I think when I've had those conversations one-on-one, people really, like, you see this light bulb go off and you're like, oh, I thought you had access to all of this. Like, thought it was all fair game. And you're like, no, it's really not. And then they're more empathetic and realize, like, wait a second, they're not trying to hide things. They're not being sloppy. They're not, they really can only report on what they have. So that's a really, really good one. And I wish we were willing to talk about it more. And, you know, it's not about, you know, attacking the person who's not talking to us or, you know, saying that they're doing something wrong. It's more about, we want to be fair in our journalism. Being fair means asking these questions of this individual. They would not allow us time to do that. So maybe you say that, and then you say, here are the questions we wanted to know, though. And we hope that they now answer them, and you put it out there for the public so they know you are still working for them. Yeah, Rachel.
Yeah, can I jump in? Okay. Yeah, I work for the public broadcaster, and there's the assumption that we lean or are biased towards government. And I think what I would want people to know about the public broadcaster is that we do not want to be sensational. You know, we're not after commercial interests. We want to be factual. We want to do enough research. And even when there's a lot of news breaking on social media, we want to ascertain that that has really happened and follow it to the end instead of running, because we want to be the first to break. And then, of course, being misguided by misinformation.
Yeah, ownership comes up so much, or your connection of where money comes from, right? And then there's this assumption that if you are a public organization, that you are then biased toward the government, right? That comes up often, even here in the United States with NPR. That's something that they have to kind of explain all the time. And so we know that's not true, right? We work there. We know there's this separation. We know we can do the reporting that we want. And so let's talk about that. Let's say that on stories. Let's even come out. I have some examples that I'll show you where newsrooms have actually come out and done kind of like little campaigns on the radio where they explain, you know, we are separate. Yes, we receive funding, but they do not control anything we report. They do not have any say over this. And I just openly saying that, some people may not still believe you. And again, we're going to kind of set those people aside. But there are a group of people that they don't know that. And, you know, in the US, with a lot of news organizations being advertising based, this happens a lot that someone will say, oh, well, the hospital's an advertiser with you. That's why you're not holding them accountable. Or I've even heard like, oh, well, you're working with lawmakers to try to get this law passed. That's why you did this story. And you're like, oh my gosh, no, like absolutely not. That is never something that we would do. But people don't know that unless we tell them. It's kind of like, I don't necessarily know what a plumber does or what my mom does, who's a nurse, right? Like, I don't know what her daily job is like. And why would I, if it's not been explained to me? And so why do we expect other people to kind of understand these things? Instead, let's explain them to them. And kind of basically the idea is you're filling that information void so they don't fill it themselves with misassumptions that are generally negative and that aren't most of the time true. There's another comment here from Jacob. I wish for my community to know that my work as a journalist is not to harm anybody, but to simply report on issues that affect people's lives. For instance, crime, child abuse, lack of basic social services, bad governance. Yes, Jacob, that's a great one. And I actually have some really good examples that I'm going to show here about how you can talk about crime specifically, what your approach is, how you're not trying to harm people, but it's part of your role in the community. So I'm going to share those here. Okay, I'm going to share my screen again because I think we had some good comments. So now what I'm going to do is I just have a lot of examples of how You can build trust in your community by talking about some of these misassumptions that people have. So first, we're going to start with if people ever say that you are unfair or that you are biased or that you have an agenda, how can you explain that that is not true? And so first, this is an example from the San Diego Union Tribune, and they publish what they call a fairness checklist. And what they say is that we work hard to be fair. Everything we do is subject to this checklist. And they will decline to publish a story if it does not meet this standard. They say we don't shade the truth, we let the facts lead us, we show our work. And so this is what the fairness checklist is, probably things that in your news organization you are doing every day. So why don't we put this out there and say, before we publish a story, these things, it has to meet this criteria. It has to meet this checklist. And so things that they say that to ensure fairness, their stories they must be accurate. They must keep in mind their own values, their own biases, and avoid imposing them on others or in their stories. They pay careful attention to word choice and the overall tone, making sure that their stories are fair and neutral. They try to bring a diversity of views in their best light. They frame stories fairly, openly. They ensure that there are no surprises in the story or for their sources. They say that sources should have an opportunity before publication to know the full thrust of the report and respond to any meaningful details or accusations. They also say here, their standard is to give subjects and sources ample time to respond, generally a minimum of 24 hours. So they're on the record with that. This is how we work to be fair. They include responses. They reach out to people who are involved in the story. And they really do make a sincere effort to reconcile conflicting information. And so just having this out there and publishing something like this is so helpful, because what you can do is if you have someone contact you and make the accusation that you don't try to be fair, that you have an agenda or you have a bias, you can say, I want to share something with you. This is what we do for every story. And then you can talk about more specifics within that story. But just having this then gives you something to point to. It gives you something to share on social media, and you can even link to it within every story. Specifically, when it comes to politics, there are lots of accusations that go around about fairness and about having an agenda. Something that you can do is write about what your approach is to covering the election. How are you going to work to be fair? How are you working to make sure you're treating each candidate fairly? And write about that. And so WCPO, a television station in Cincinnati, Ohio, said, this is how we are going to plan visits from presidential candidates. And they said, when a candidate comes to visit, we will live stream on Facebook. We will report on the visit, and they'll provide coverage of issues surrounding that visit. One thing they will not do is air the entire event live on TV. So they're kind of laying out how they work to be fair, what their policy is. So then how this comes into play on social, they had someone ask them, why do you choose not to cover Bernie Sanders rallies? And someone in the newsroom responded and said, hey, we will cover Senator Sanders if he comes to our area. We plan to cover all candidates the same. But people might see a story on Bernie Sanders on the national news and be like, why isn't this on our local channel? Well, it's because he's not here in our area, right? And this is what we promised. We said, if they come to visit, we will do X. If they don't come to visit, we're not doing that. And so again, having this allows you to then share something. Having this written down also, I think, allows for more accountability in the newsroom, and it allows other journalists to be more comfortable kind of answering people that they might encounter on social media about how they did their jobs. The other thing you can do is you can add notes to the top or bottom of stories that explain how you worked to be fair. Ideally, these types of notes would go at the top of the story so that people see it right away. And so these are two examples from a public radio station in Pennsylvania, WITF. And in both of these, they talk about how, well, we'll talk the first one here. It says, here are the most prominent perspectives on this story. We are on the lookout for stereotypes and assumptions in our own work, and we invite you to point out what we may have missed. Contact us. And so this is really great because they're saying, we know there are going to be stereotypes. We know there are assumptions, but we are looking out for them and we are trying not to include them. And if you think we missed any, please contact us and let us know. This is a newer note that they've used, and they use this on a story about critical race theory. That's a hot button issue here in the US right now. And what they did is they wanted to make sure every time the station was covering critical race theory, they got a lot of people who assumed that they were on one side or the other, but they aren't. And they wanted to make sure they know that. And so what they said is, we know this is a complicated issue. That's why this story includes explanations from the elected officials involved and perspectives from relevant advocates, as well as the likely outcomes of the action taking place. We are leaving it up to you, the reader, to draw your own conclusions. So just kind of saying that and making sure people understand, one, we know this is complicated. Here's how we're working to cover it. And when people have put, I should mention, trust is sometimes a hard thing to measure, whether or not things like this work. One way at Trusting News that we know that notes like this work is that when stories have notes like this, they don't get as many negative comments or allegations of bias. And so for us, that's a win. If the news organization isn't hearing as much of that when they normally would, we see that as something that this note is helping. So Sam, this goes to what you were talking about during the coronavirus and COVID, when it was first happening, television stations, everyone, newspapers, constant coverage, right? And people were accusing news organizations of basically wanting to talk about the number of people getting sick, talking about the number of people who are dying, that they were loving covering this. Totally not the case. No one wanted to cover this. No one wanted this to happen, right? And so they were being accused of hiding information about people who are recovering from the coronavirus. And they did a story and they said, look, we are not hiding information about the number of people who have recovered from COVID-19. We actually don't know. We're not able to report on those numbers because those numbers aren't being kept. The government is not keeping track of them. Hospitals are not keeping track of them. So we don't have the information. That's why we're not able to report on it. That's why you're not seeing the stories. It's not because we don't want people to get better. It's because we don't have the data to report on it. So I thought it was a really good story just explaining that. And they had a lot of people that said, wow, I didn't know that. Why? And then a question of why aren't they tracking this? And then that led to another story explaining how it's difficult to track recovery versus someone who's getting sick or dying. So another area that was talking about bias, this other area, a lack of knowledge about your thoughtful process or reasoning. And the first thing I'm going to mention is corrections. And I'm going to let Paul talk for a second about a solution that he has. So a lot of us have corrections policies, right? We know when we issue a correction, we have a policy on it. But the question is, can people easily find that policy? And then the next question is, if someone wants you to issue a correction, how do they get in touch with you about it? And if it's not easy for them to get in touch with you about it, how are they going to make a correction? And they may just think you don't care about being right, which is totally not true. We want to be right. We always want to be right. And so how can we make it easy for people to, one, see when we correct stories, how we correct stories, and then 3, get in touch with us about corrections? And so, Paul, do you want to talk a minute about something that you've worked on that can help make the process easier?
Yeah, thank you. And we appreciate partnering with Lynn and Trusting News on some of our relationships in the U.S. news industry. So what happened was, and by the way, as a precursor to this, the Media Project, we're this international network, and we care about solutions and trust a lot. And in my work as a journalism professor, I was noticing a lot of these trends that we're talking about today, and issues of trust, and really centering around, we wondered if we could do something to improve the way corrections are made, because when studies show in the US that when people realize newsrooms when they see a newsroom that does correct itself when it makes mistakes, their trust goes up. So it's a big factor. So several studies have shown that. And it shows that journalists are different than Hollywood and other industries that may embellish truth, that we actually care about truth and facts. So one of the things I noticed was that a lot of newsrooms in the US that do make corrections, they were doing it the same sort of clunky way that they did 30, 40 years ago when I started in on the business, which is, they expect someone to make a phone call or write to the newsroom. It used to be a letter. Sometimes now we can send an email. But as you all know, we have many leaders in the Media Project, leaders of newsrooms all around the world. You have many team members, sometimes turnover of your staff. So if a reader is communicating, hey, there was an error in your story, sometimes it's bouncing around the newsroom in various emails or not making its way to the right person. So what we built was a tool called CX, or corrections, Vet News. Vet News is our vetnews.com is our website for this company that built this product. I'll put the link there. And the product is called CX. And what CX is, it's a corrections management tool. So we have a small code we install on, or the newsroom installs on its content management system, and that places a button at the bottom of every article. So maybe you've seen that at the bottom of Religion Unplugged articles, where at the same place where you see buttons to share on Facebook or Twitter or Pinterest, it says request a correction, and you click on the button. So from the reader's experience, when they click on that button, because they see that we misspelled Sam's name, you can then select a drop-down menu and say, okay, I want to report a typo, or I want to report a factual error, or I want to report a missing context, or something I see that's biased here. And they fill out their name, their phone number, and they share what was wrong, evidence, so links, evidence of what was wrong, and then a proposed rewording if necessary. So what we're doing is crowdsourcing from readers information to help the editors improve the fairness, accuracy of the content, and also at the same time helping readers to think categorically about what their criticism or feedback is. So we think that's helping to train them to be media literate. And we're noticing that some news organizations in the US some of them are turning off their comments because they don't want readers just attacking each other or being, uncivil. And this kind of tool actually funnels helpful reader feedback in a constructive way to the news organization, and we think helps the reader feel engaged in the news organization, as if they're helping bolster the accuracy of the news organization. So once they hit send on this button, that information flows into a system, the CX system, that the editors can log into, and it's a dashboard that has all of their correction requests and reader feedbacks coming in. And built into that system is a communication tool. So the reader immediately receives an email that says, thank you, we've received your feedback. We'll be in touch within the next 24 hours or 72 hours. Thank you for your concern for our company and our brand and our journalism. And then the journalist gets an alert on Slack or by email that a correction request arrived, so to go log in. And there's some analytics, by the way, some dashboard tools that show you where in the world corrections are coming from, which stories are getting the most requests. And meanwhile, there's a tool then for you to adjudicate, helps you look at these requests. And if 10 people all spotted the misspelling on Sam's name, we can collect those in the same response. So I'm writing one response to all those people in a respectful way. And the emails that go out have, you know, our brand logo on it. And it allows me to thank the readers. Thank you for your concern for our brand. Thank you for spotting this error. We fixed it. Here's the link. And meanwhile, if you don't follow us on Twitter already, here's a way to follow us now, or you could give a discount or whatnot. But we've created what we think is a way to engage with readers, use their knowledge, because look, we know newsrooms have had to cut some staff members, ombudsmen and women, and copy editors are sometimes fewer and far between. So this tool helps recreate that using the crowd, using the readers to do that. So I mention all that as right now the system, we got a grant from the Knight Foundation to build it and to test it. And we've tested a couple of phases of that. And we are now in about 20 newsrooms, all I think in the US. The system works on English language. Right now, all the language settings are in English. We'd love to introduce other languages down the road, but that's where it works now. And you know, right now, Vet News is a standalone company, but it has a close association with the Media Project. And it is a perk that we offer to any member of the Media Project if you want to test with us this tool in your newsroom, or to use it and to give us feedback on how to keep improving it. I would very much welcome and offer it to you for free to use. So let me just put my Vet News email here. If you want to, I can send you links to a demo. And if it's something you're interested in, I'm happy to show you that and offer it to you to use for free at your newsroom, or newsrooms that you know of that might want to use it. So we want to be a culture at the Media Project that cares about trust. And we know our members, a lot of people on this call are leaders in their newsrooms. And so we know that they'll actually put into practice a lot of what Lynn's going through today. And we look forward to being in touch about that and these various opportunities and tools, including this one I just told you about. So thank you, Lynn, for giving me a chance to share about that.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And I think, you know, it's something so simple. Again, corrections. We all have a process in our newsrooms about how we do this. The question is, does the public know what that process is? And can they easily get in touch with us if they want to make a correction? And I think what most newsrooms find is that no, it is not easy to get in touch with them, or corrections get lost because there isn't a clear system. So if you can create a clear system, whether that's using Vet News or that's using something else, that's going to just only increase trust with your users, because they see, hey, you're asking us for feedback and you're acting upon it once you get in touch with me. And that's part of kind of closing the loop there with what we would call the feedback loop, which I will talk about. Yes. And I'm putting the link to the presentation in here again. So for Sam, I just put the link in there again, so feel free, it's right there in the chat. And I'm going to share my screen again, and I'm going to go through a lot more examples here, and then I want to try to save like 15-20 minutes for any questions. So I will go through this kind of quickly, but also make sure I hit on exactly what the newsroom did. And again, these are examples of things newsrooms have done to explain their process. And so this example comes from the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. And here in the US actually that was just this year, last year in 2020, we had different protest and social justice movement happening in streets all around the country. And so people had a question about, you know, why aren't you calling these riots? And so word choice is something that we as journalists talk about and think about so carefully. We are constantly kind of thinking, are we using the right word? Well, let's tell people that we think carefully about word choice. And so in this case, what they are saying is that they chose to use the word protest because they want to, they're working to basically think about their aim is to accurately and fairly report what we see in plain English, whether we're describing peaceful marches and demonstrations or violent clashes. And so what they said is that, you know, what we saw is that for the most part, these were protests. Yes, sometimes at night, did it turn into burning things down? Did it turn into looting? Yes, but would that be fair to label everything that happened that day a riot when 90% of it was actually peaceful and people protesting? And they said they don't think so. And so they wrote about this. They explained that. They did a whole story about it. And then what I really love that they did, and we've talked about how more people are moving to social media to get their news. So this story is great. It's on your website. It might be in your newspaper, but if you're not reaching the audience where they are, so in this case on Instagram, people are not going to see it. And so what they did is they put together some social cards here using an app called Canva, which is super easy to use. And they basically put the answers by adding a photo behind it of some of these questions, why they chose to call it protest, why they aren't reporting on records, all sorts of things that they were being asked. But the key here is getting it to where people are. So in this case, Instagram. Another way that you can talk about your policies is by publishing your ethics. We all have ethics. Some people don't know that. Some people say, what do you mean journalists have ethics? Yes, we do. So whatever your ethics policies are, consider publishing them. And now this doesn't mean that you need to take what's internal and make it external. That's not what we're saying. You can make versions of it, or maybe just highlight the main facts of it, right? But once you make that public, the idea then is to link to it when it applies to a story. So this is an example from a student media news organization, and they've made their ethics policy public and searchable, and it's really great. But then when they had to think about whether or not to name a student or not, and they decided to allow him to remain anonymous, they explained that the student, who identifies himself as a gay male and has not came out, asked to speak anonymously. Because the information he shared involves his personal medical information and his sexual orientation, Annenberg Media is honoring his request in accordance with our ethics policy. So they've added the explanation within the story, and now they've linked to this ethics policy where people can learn more. That's kind of like the ideal situation of getting those explanations into the daily content. Another example of that, when covering a suicide, that is something that most of the time journalists or news organizations don't cover. When you do cover it, explain why. And so the Coloradoan explained that, you know, it's their policy to normally not report on individual suicides. But in this case, we felt like it was important to complete our coverage of the case and provide resources for those struggling with mental illness. So they shared this explanation on social media when they shared a link to the story that talked about suicide. And a really easy question that you can answer is how this story was reported. This goes back a little bit to something that Sam had mentioned, just about like how you fact check and how it's hard. It's hard to get information, right? And so the San Francisco Chronicle just added this little explanation inside their print story online and in print, and said, the Chronicle reviewed court filings and supporting documents. We interviewed Todd Hearn, someone who was interviewed in the story, his attorney, and legal and technical experts, and sought comment from PG&E and S&E Electric, so two electric companies in San Francisco, over the course of several days. So they're also being very specific about how they tried to get in touch with these companies, because the companies declined to comment. So they explained, no, we tried to contact them and we did it over the course of several days. So then you can't necessarily be accused, or people are less likely to accuse you of, oh, you just didn't even try to reach them. No, we did. They still chose not to speak with us. I don't know if anyone has heard this, but this is something that people sometimes assume, is that we pay people to talk to us, or we pay people for an interview. In most cases, this is something that journalists, ethical journalists, do not do. And so coming out and just saying that, we do not pay sources for information. We do not pay subjects to shoot photos or videos of them. This is something the Colorado Sun built out in their ethics page. Again, Maybe it's not exactly what it says in their internal ethics, but they wrote it in a way that makes sense for the public. They also explain what on the record and off the record means. So many, not all journalists agree with what on background is, not for attribution, off the record, on the record, right? So if we can, as journalists, kind of unanimously agree, why should we expect the public to know what these words mean? And so just adding that explanation here can be so helpful. So sometimes some of this transparency can be looked at as part of us playing that role of being media. We're trying to be, provide media literacy for the public so they can now better combat the information world and get through all the information that is out there. So something else you can talk about is who you are and what you cover. It's really important. We talked about differentiating yourself, right? Because media, we all get lumped into media, but instead tell your own story. Why should people invest in you, feel a connection to you, or trust your team? If we don't tell our own story and who we are and how we work hard, who else is going to do it? No one is. So we have to do this ourselves. And so when you want to talk about your brand in your news organization, or what your goals are as even a freelance journalist, things you can talk about is, what do you believe in? What are your values? What do you cover? Some people will think, that you're biased because you're not covering something that's happening overseas. And you're like, well, that's not our goal. Our goal is to cover what's happening here in this community. It's a very small area that we cover, and that's what we focus on. What makes you different? What do you hope to accomplish? What impact do you have? What is your history? I'm not sure how many of you have staff bios on your website. I know sometimes there are safety concerns with that, but if it is possible to make and create staff bios and make them public, and especially if you can have photos, I would really encourage you to do that. What that does is that creates a connection and allows people to, again, build that relationship. When we're talking about trust, they're based in relationships. And so how can we get people to better know who we are and who our staff is? And so things that staff should include is who they are, what they do, what they cover, what types of stories, how to get in touch with them, talk about it in a way that makes sense for the public, and anything you can include professional. And if people are willing, a little personal information. Maybe there's someone that cares about the environment. Maybe they belong to a certain church. If people are willing to share those can be good tidbits to include. And then the other kind of important thing about this is, if you have this all available, don't make people hunt for it. It should be something that's easy to find. Maybe it's every time you have a byline with someone's name, people can click on it and go to their staff bio. Maybe there's a staff bio page that's easily linked from the homepage, but people do want this information, and it does help build that relationship, which then can build trust. We had, I think it was Rachel who talked about funding. Okay, so what we know is that people don't know how news is funded. Actually, here in the US, when people were surveyed most recently, they thought that the news business was thriving. And why did they think that? They thought that because they were watching the news all the time, especially during COVID. And they were accusing news organizations of profiting off of COVID and loving COVID because it's, oh, you're always on air. You're getting so many eyeballs on your story on the web. When in reality, a lot of news organizations lost money because advertising budgets from local businesses were the first to be cut. And so we need to explain this so that people don't make those negative misassumptions. I think it's also important to think about that it's natural and smart for people to be skeptical about how news is funded. As journalists, we value skepticism. We know the importance of following the money. So I think it's okay for people to wonder, how is your news funded? And we should be willing and openly willing to talk about it and answer those questions so that we can explain, here's who funds us, but that doesn't impact our stories, what we can cover, what we can't cover. The Digital News Report found that in a number of richer Western countries, there has been a significant increase in the number of people who are paying for online news. But overall, the percentage of people paying for online news remains low. So when they asked people across 20 countries if they've ever paid for online news in the last year, what they found is 17% said they had. That is the highest in Norway, followed by Sweden and the US and Finland. It is the lowest in France, Germany, and the United Kingdom. Something else that's interesting is Pew had asked people how trust can differ when it comes to a public media organization and a private media organization. And what they found is that people generally trust the public news organization more than the private news organization. And they also found that generally people trust public news organizations. So trust in publicly funded news organizations tends to be high, and it tends to be higher than private media news organizations. The bottom line here is people pay for products they trust. And if people do not trust you, they're going to be less likely to subscribe to you, pay for your content, or support you in any way. This again, excuse me, goes back to this data point in the beginning, where you have younger people saying they feel the least fairly represented by the media. Well, that means they're the most unlikely to pay for news. A Knight Foundation and Gallup poll in 2019 found that when people were provided information about the financial situation facing local news organizations and the fact that the financial situation is not good, they were actually more likely to donate to nonprofits and organizations that support local journalism. So talking about your funding, talking about where your financial standpoint is, people will feel more likely to donate to you if they know it and they know what the situation is. Another thing that's really important when it comes to funding is you do want to separate your funding from your coverage. So here, we've talked about that, but here's an example of how you can do that. This is from NPR. The story was on Amazon. And so during the story, the host says, after they're talking about the story and talking about how the story is, what is the human cost of Amazon's convenience? They insert a line here that says, we will tell you now that Amazon is a financial supporter of NPR News, and we are raising these questions about Amazon all the same, which is how it should work. And so basically saying, yes, we are recognizing they support NPR, but that doesn't matter because we're still holding them accountable as we should and as we would. And so I think we have about 18 minutes here. And the bottom line here that I hope you take away from the funding part is, if you want people to understand how your news is funded, you have to tell that story. And so I'm going to stop sharing and I will take time to answer questions. The other thing that I would keep in mind is, if you're wondering what to explain or how to explain something, look at the feedback you are getting on social media. Take a look at it, put it into themes, and then decide, okay, how can we explain some of this so that people understand how we do our jobs? And so that's kind of, I'm open. I don't know if we have any questions, Paul, that have come in, but I'm glad to take some.
I'm sure we will soon, now that we're opening up questions. Yeah. And I'll throw one out as we're waiting for other questions to come in, Lynn. You know, religion reporting and the importance of religion is really the big theme of the media project. And it's an important one for our friends around the world. Religion is very important in every context, but, you know, one thing we've noticed is a lot of our peer organizations that do journalism training and professional development around the world, some of them don't have the same respect or view of religion. And I'm just curious about your, to kind of just throw that on the table. What is the disconnect or any data that you've seen around the topic of religion in audiences? And what the big one that we tend to see is that mainstream media in the US and some other places tend to cover religion with certain archetypes like conflict or religion bad, or that surveys show that journalists tend to be less religious than their audiences. And any thoughts on, data on that, but also how we can rebuild trust on this topic?
Yeah, so we at Trusting News actually just did surveys with conservatives, so people who identify as politically conservative in the US. And a common complaint that came out of that was the lack of religious coverage or coverage of religion in communities. And this was something that for news organizations was kind of eye-opening, because they realized we really only cover it when it's an abortion issue or it's around a holiday, and they're not covering it consistently other than that. And so what happens is people who are a part of a religious group, when that's the only coverage they see reflected in their community, they assume that that news organization is biased in one way or another, because they're painting the religion in one direction or the other. And so the goal of that is to say, okay, if we have people who support different religions in our community, which we probably all do, how are we covering them more fairly, and not just covering them when it comes to an extreme view or when it comes to something that is a holiday? And this goes for everything. This isn't just religion. We really should be taking a look at who is in our community and seeing, does our coverage align with who is there? And so, for example, with crime coverage, are we only going into certain neighborhoods when there's a crime? And if so, that's problematic, because it paints that neighborhood as a bad neighborhood. It paints the people who live there as people who commit crimes. And we shouldn't be doing that, right? So we need to, in general, stop that generalization. And specifically with religion, are there other stories you should be telling throughout the year, and not things that kind of feed into the stereotypes that people may think of a certain religion? And if we don't stop doing that, basically if we continue to do that and feed into stereotypes, that is continuing to lead to that distrust, because people who associate with those groups feel as if they're not represented, and then they are more likely to go to something that is something that they believe in, which also doesn't really help kind of the whole goal of news, which is to make sure people have information that has a lot of perspectives, not just one that people agree with.
Thank you. Let's hear some questions from the audience. Rachel just posted one, which I assume means we can.
Yeah, I can go ahead and I'll take, so Rachel says, there has been debates on the pros and cons of media organizations pronouncing themselves on support for a given presidential candidate or even calling elections. How does this affect trust in your media organization? Okay, great question, Rachel. And we have been working, we did some special election training back in 2020 before the election. And we had so many reporters say that because their news organization came out in support of a candidate, it made their reporting harder. They were getting kind of attacked and verbally attacked, but also yelled at when they would go to rallies, because they're associated with that news organization. But they're not associated with that opinion, right? We know as journalists that's separate, but people don't understand that. And they just think it's the same thing. And so it really, opinion coverage in general is impacting trust at a really great level. And so something that we need to do if we're going to continue to have opinion coverage, specifically when it comes to like supporting a candidate or supporting an issue, we need to make sure it is clearly labeled everywhere. So what that means is we need to first look at the words we're using. Words like column, op-ed, people don't know what those mean. We need to use the word opinion. And the word opinion should be in the headline. It should be immediately when it's shared on social. And we should make sure that when someone clicks the share button on Facebook, that it travels with it. I was actually just teaching a class this week, and I gave an example from USA Today where they had the word column in the headline, and they tagged the USA Today opinion team. But when you click share as a user, the opinion disappears. So now everyone that sees it when I share it doesn't know that that was an opinion. So it's totally lost. And then people will not trust that organization because they say, well, that's biased. And you're like, well, yeah, it is because it's opinion, but we're not telling them that. So labeling becomes really important. I will also say there are some news organizations that are rethinking whether or not, that's here in the US, that they should basically give support or endorse a candidate. Personally, I think that's a great idea. Some, people might continue to do it. I think if you're going to do it, make sure it's labeled, make sure it's clear that it's separate, and prepare your journalist to be able to talk about it and explain the difference.
Great question. We've got another one from Martina. Do you want to read it, Lynn? Or
Yeah, let's see. It says, how would you prevent mistakes in scientific news? We had some listener reactions to a science article on ventilation in school to prevent coronavirus. Only with the help of an architect who was a specialist in passive buildings, we were able to precise the article in a day. So yes, so the question I think is, how do you make sure that issues that are very kind of scientific or very complicated, I feel like everything with COVID, right? This becomes an issue. How do you make sure that you're preventing these mistakes? And I think the key is making sure you are, it sounds like you did this, seeking out these experts, which is good. Making sure the expert is the right person to speak with. I've had, I don't know if you've seen this happen, but I've seen it happen where with COVID, they just talk to any doctor. Like, I don't know why they're talking to them, but because they're a doctor, they're being quoted, and people have a problem with that. Like, why are they an expert on COVID? Like, so we need to also be careful about, like, what does that expert mean? Just because someone is a doctor may not make them the best person to talk specifically about COVID spreading. And so let's make sure we're thinking carefully about the experts, picking those experts, involving them in the process. I think the other key part, though, is explaining to our viewers and our readers why we chose this person. So for this story, hopefully, as you brought in this architect, explaining why the architect was appropriate to use for the story, and that you brought them on so that they could answer questions and make sure you got the story right. And I think sometimes we're kind of unwilling to admit that we don't know everything, but the reality is we don't. We rely on others to tell us information, and then we explain it. And so let's explain why we rely on those experts. It's also a good idea to talk to multiple people and get multiple kind of opinions about things. So maybe you have time to talk to a couple architects. Maybe it's a daily story. You can only talk to one right away. Let's say another architect contacts you and says, I saw the story. I have some other perspective I'd like to add. Take that call, see what they have to say, and see if there's a way to make that reporting better. It doesn't mean that your story was wrong, but could you make it better by now adding an additional voice or an additional opinion to the mix?
great. I want to call on someone who, one of our board member, Jennifer Arul, who, by the way, everybody I've met from India who's a journalist knows who Jennifer is. She's kind of has a reputation like a Barbara Walters.
Oh, that's great.
As a national broadcaster. So Jennifer.
Oh, Jennifer, I think you're muted.
Okay, I'm muted. Okay, Lynn, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, okay. So I wanted to talk a little bit, if there was the time, about impartiality when it comes to writing a human interest story. Did I get it right or wrong that we should not necessarily be impartial when it comes to a human interest story, a human rights violation story? Well, what is your real view on this? I think it's something that all journalists are faced with. Lynn, I'd love to just spend a little while on that.
Yeah, I think it's a really great question. And so the data point that I shared, basically what it found is it said that a majority of people do want a variety of views, and they do want to be the ones to make up their own minds. So what they want is they want news organizations to give them information from a variety of views, and then they will make up their mind on where they stand. Now, what that data also found, though, is that younger people are more likely to say that when it comes to issues like social justice, impartiality is just, it's not possible. They think news organizations should take a stand. So that's younger people, 18 to 25. They think news organizations should take a stand on social justice issues. Now, from a news organization standpoint, I think you can decide that, let's take LGBTQ rights. Maybe you decide, we are for everyone having equal rights in this country, in this world. No matter what the situation is, we want people to be treated fairly, and we don't want them to be treated unfairly because of maybe who they like, what they look like. And if you as a news organization believe that, and want to take that stance, I think that is okay. You just should be transparent about it. I think that's the key, is that if you're going to take these stance, be very transparent about it. And also talk about how, though, you are still going to work to be fair in that reporting. So there was an example in San Diego, where I'm from, where a nonprofit news organization, Voice of San Diego, they decided to come out about their stance on education. And they said, our agenda when it comes to education is so that we want everyone in San Diego County, every child, to have the best education possible. So when we report on stories, those are the types of stories you are going to see. When we cover a story, we're going to highlight things that we think could make education better. And we're going to be critical of things that we think would make education worse. And so they were very open about that. And they still cover the issues, but they were open about, this is why you might see more stories about X or about Y, because we have an agenda towards this.
Yeah,
And
but
yeah.
sorry, Lynn, I wrote a very hard-hitting story on police brutality for our TMP website, for the webpage. Now, obviously, nobody from the police was going to talk to me, okay? At the same time, from the day that story has actually come out, I have faced a great deal of pressure from within the police organization. Nobody has actually said, you didn't ask us. Nobody has said we didn't say anything, et cetera, et cetera. But the point is, maybe they were expecting to say something, but refused to. So I'm really a bit confused. It's crazy to say this, but I'm a bit confused. How do you be impartial? Nobody's talking to you, as Sam said. So where does that leave you as a journalist? You know, it was a pretty gruesome story that I put out, but I've just faced the music on that one story alone.
Yeah, so I think, I don't know if you did this, but I would try my best to explain how you would attempted to get them to respond. So if you called them, you emailed them, I would lay that out in the article. And when you share the story on social, add that to the text that you add on Facebook. Maybe even consider doing a video about, hey, I just want to be really open about how I attempted to get a hold of the police. Here is all the things I did. Maybe show your emails, maybe show a text message of whatever you might have shown, right? And then what that does is that's putting everything out there. And I think hopefully maybe that'll put some pressure on the police to say, okay, maybe we should talk next time, because now we kind of look bad because they're telling them how we ignored this reporter. If it doesn't, at least at the very least, it shows the public you did try to get in touch and you tried really hard and you didn't just ignore them.
Right. Thank you, Lynn. I think that's a good learning point for anybody who's listening to this session. Thank you.
You're welcome.
We are just about out of time. I see TJ has a question that he wanted us to ask. And I do want to announce before we close about the session tomorrow. TJ, I'm not sure I understand the term trolling. He writes, to what extent does trolling figure in presidential campaigns? Is there a study on it, how to counter it?
Yeah, I think he's talking about when people are on social media and they kind of just try to harass people and add content in just to kind of create chaos. That's kind of how I would describe trolling. TJ, if that's not correct, let me know. But so trolling does happen probably all the time. You've seen this in your own comments on social media, probably, especially around politics. How do you counteract it? That link, and I'll share it again here from First Draft, has some tips just on how to kind of combat disinformation, because sometimes when people are trolling, they're pasting information that's incorrect or information that's not true. So that link there has some tips on that if they're spreading misinformation or disinformation. Something else that I would really consider doing is deleting comments from people that are not helpful. So if someone is just harassing someone online after you post a story, if someone is posting something that is false information, if someone is saying something that is inappropriate or that is a racial slur against someone else, delete the comment. And so if you do that, have a comment policy that explains you are going to do that and you're going to not tolerate that type of behavior. You may think, oh, people are going to get upset. yeah, the people trolling might, but guess what? We don't really care necessarily about the trolling. We don't want the trolling. We want to have a constructive conversation. And the people that are left are going to be grateful that you have deleted that information and blocked that person. So now they can continue and have a good conversation, which is what they want.
Fantastic. Well, we have to wrap it up here, and let's please thank Lynn with maybe some applause or reactions, and if you know how to use that button there. This has been fantastic, and Lynn, thank you for all of these tips, which I think we all can learn from. And this group, more than any other I've ever encountered, are the Media Project leaders and members. They put stuff into practice. So there's people on this call who are mentoring groups of journalists. Rachel and Josephine, for example, are mentoring groups of women, female journalists in Kenya. And there's mentorship as part of our culture. So this will be replicated in many places. We'll send out the link to the slides to you as well, everyone here. And just a quick plug for tomorrow, our final day, we'll have Jill Geisler, our leadership expert, back with us. And she'll be speaking about coach with care, being a coach and not a fixer. And so she's going to lead us through an interactive conversation about how coaching people is not telling them what to do, but coming up with great decisions and ideas. So that's going to be emceed again by our senior programs manager, Melissa Harrison, who is traveling today and tuning in here and there today, but she'll be back tomorrow. And we look forward to seeing you all then. And thanks again for joining us. And thanks again, Lynn, for sharing with us today.
You. And if any of you do try anything, or if you put any of this into practice, I would love to see examples. So please do not hesitate to get in touch with me. And also, if you need help putting any of this into practice, or you want to kind of draft something and send it my way, I also would be glad to look at it. So please do get in touch.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Have a great day, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.